To begin, so good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Institute for European, Russian and Eurasian Studies at GW. My name is Marlène Laruelle. I'm the director of the Institute. And it's my pleasure to welcome you today for this very unique event devoted to the special issue of our journal Demokratizacja, the Journal of Post-Soviet Democratization, devoted to Mikhail Gorbachev, Perestroika and New Thinking, a retrospective. I will be telling you a few more about this special issue in a few minutes. I just would like to begin by thanking the journal editor, Robert Ortung, and the team around him, including Ellen Powell, who has been both all of them working, doing a great job in putting together this special issue and globally making the journal now entering, being part of Scopus and becoming really a reference journal for our field. So it's a semester of anniversary. It's the 60th anniversary of our institute this year, but it's also, of course, and that's why we are here today, the 30th anniversary of the collapse of the Soviet Union, the 30th anniversary of the August putsch that kind of accelerated the end of the Soviet Union. And for that occasion, we had the chance to translate an article by Mikhail Gorbachev that was very recently published, and then to collect articles by several important policy and scholarly figures who have worked and witnessed this incredible historical moment that are still shaping the world we are living in. So before introducing our speaker, I would like very briefly, but for something very important, give the floor to a distinguished guest, Pavel Palashenko, who is has been for a long time Mikhail Gorbachev translator, advisor, friend also, and who will be reading for us a message that Mikhail Gorbachev addressed to us today. Pavel, can I give you the floor? Did we lose Pavel? I don't see him anymore. Okay, so let's maybe move on, and then Pavel, he was with us a few seconds ago. He will reconnect and be able to read for us this message by Gorbachev. So let's maybe move to the discussion. As I said, we have a great group of scholars. I will very shortly introduce them. You can read longer bios on their website. We will first hear from Ambassador Jack Matlock, who was the ambassador to the Soviet Union during the Perestroika years. Then we will hear from Svetlana Safranskaya, who has been the director of Russia program at the National Security Archive at GW. Then from Mark Kramer, director of Cold War Studies at Harvard University. Then Archie Brown, emeritus professor of politics at the University of Oxford. And last but not least, George Breslauer, professor of the graduate school in the Department of Political Science at the University of California, Berkeley. I think Pavel just joined us. Is that right? Yeah, Pavel, can you hear us?
Yes, that's correct. Sorry, I had a connection problem.
Yeah, let me give you the floor and very rapidly show on the screen, share the screen and show the letter that we just received from Mikhail Gorbachev regarding this special issue. Pavel, the floor is yours.
Yes, let me read it in English. Let me see if I can do that. Yes, I'll just have to translate from the letter. I talked to Mikhail Gorbachev yesterday, and we put together this letter. And in this letter, he says, "Dear friends, I'm very glad that this project came through. We started last year, and it took quite a lot of time. I had to recall many things. I reread my speeches from that time, which are included in my collected works. And it's amazing the road that we traveled. And I traveled it again, as it were. The most recent volume in the collected works takes the events up to the 13th of November, 1991. And it's a tremendous drama. I wrote this article because I believe that all of this is relevant today. Perestroika is a process of change. When we began, we knew that our country needed change like air to breathe. And at the same time, I was saying to our partners that all of us need to change. We all need to change. I don't think all of them agreed at that time, but perhaps they came to agree later. And today, the situation in the world is such that we can say once again, we all need to change. And therefore, the experience of those years is so important. I know that you wrote comments on my article, and I hope that I will be able to read them in translation. And I thank you in advance for that. That's it.
Thank you so much, Pavel, for having been able to have the issue discussed with Mikhail Gorbachev and for getting that greetings from him for us. It's really meaningful a lot for our journal, our institute, and all of us here. And I think we all share Gorbachev comment that we all need to change if we want things to improve globally and the international scene. Let me now give the floor to our group of distinguished speakers. And as I said, we will begin with Ambassador Matlock. Ambassador, the floor is yours. Ambassador, can you hear us? It seems the ambassador cannot hear us. So while we try to have him hearing us, Svetlana, can I give you the floor?
Yes, thank you very much for organizing this project. It is a very important project to hear Mikhail Sergeyevich 30 years, actually 35 years later after he started Perestroika, to hear his thoughts and reflections. I think his article is very honest. It's a deep analysis, looking back at what worked and what did not work. For me, the most important emphasis in this article is that it was a humanist project. Perestroika, as he says, was meant for the people. It allowed, quoting Gorbachev, it gave people ownership of their lives and of their country. The goal of Perestroika was to emancipate the human being. And I can relate to that because I am evidence of that liberation. I was at the university at the time. Perestroika allowed me as a historian to study real history, as a human being to express my thoughts and feelings, and as an international relations student to study and interact with people from different countries. And for that, I am deeply grateful. I have a couple of points that I would like to make. First of all, is that Perestroika provided a certain vision. It was relatively, in historical terms, Perestroika was short. It only was not full 7 years of that period, and yet it provided a vision internally and externally. And that vision is still relevant. It's relevant for Russia of today, and it's relevant for the world. The other point that I would like to make is about success or lack of success of certain initiatives. And many people today in Russia are looking at the result only from one perspective, from the perspective that the Soviet Union fell apart, dissolved. However, I would like to emphasize that Gorbachev never intended for that to happen. In fact, his goal was to preserve the Soviet Union as a strong and democratic state in which the republics or new states would choose to stay voluntarily and would not be forced to stay. But the country was torn apart in spite of Gorbachev's efforts by the nationalist passions, and not just the nationalist passions, but those passions were appropriated by opportunistic politicians who, if we look at the republics, were almost all former secretaries, former first secretaries of the Communist Party. And looking at the dissolution of the Soviet Union, I think we can learn a lot of lessons, but the lesson which is, in my view, not correct, is to say that Gorbachev contributed to the breakup of the Soviet Union. I think he did everything to keep it together. So, and as I mentioned, his internal and international vision, which is still relevant, his vision for the country was democratic, tolerant state, which is based on universal human values. And we all participated, people of my generation participated in the first free election in March 1989, which in my view is the freest election in Russia in which I participated. I participated in every presidential election and most of the parliamentary elections in Russia. And I believe I had more choice and more candidates to vote for in 1989. His external vision, I think, also is still relevant, but here there are so many missed opportunities, so many things about which I think Mikhail Sergeyevich is still bitter now, because his partners, his international partners, although they supported him, they never were able to fully kind of pick up this challenge, this vision, and never were able to go with him down this road, which led to great successes in arms control, in conflict resolution. And still there was so much more that could have been done if he had more international support. I love the phrase that he uses, that the Soviet Union was not entitled to assistance from abroad, but he says we were entitled to hope that our partners would give us more support. And I think there are still opportunities to look at the vision of Perestroika and to try to implement them in international relations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Svetlana, for your remarks. I now would like to turn to Ambassador Matlock. Ambassador, can you hear us? Okay. I'm not sure, I don't know what is happening with the ambassador. Can you hear us, Ambassador Matlock? I would like to give you the floor. No, so it seems we have an issue with the sounds here. Let me give the floor to Mark. Mark, the floor is yours while we try to solve the issue with Ambassador.
Okay, I am very pleased to be taking part in this forum and earlier to contribute a commentary to the Demokratizatsiya printed form. So the essay that Gorbachev produced for this, and I would also welcome Pavel Polashchenko's own comments quite separately from Mikhail Gorbachev, but if Pavel chooses to do that a bit later. But the essay is, of course, comes after Gorbachev has published numerous volumes of memoirs, 2 major volumes, and then some shorter volumes about specific topics. And it comes after thousands of interviews that he has done over the last 36 years. So there's an enormous body of material to look at if you want to try to understand some of what drove him to act as he did. But the essay is a very useful one in that it, after the passage of 3 decades now since the end of the Soviet Union, he is much more willing to talk about mistakes he believes he made, about certain choices that he might have made differently with hindsight, about other particular issues that he feels he could have done better. He of course has done that before, but I think he brings it together well in the essay to give a more focused discussion of where he sees what went right and where he sees what went wrong. Clearly, the goals he had when he came into office, which were to strengthen the Soviet Union and to strengthen the Warsaw Pact, clearly neither of those was successful. However, he did change goals over time when he was in office. And so just looking at what he wanted to do when he came into office might be unfair in the sense that almost everyone who sets goals for himself or herself will change those as circumstances change. And Gorbachev did that. He started out focusing, for example, on economic reform and then shifted fairly quickly to political change when it became clear that economic reform was going to be very difficult. So all of that in the essay, which I realize quite a few people in the audience may not yet have read, but the essay is a good one to read as a capsule overview of Gorbachev's sentiments about Perestroika and what went right and what went wrong. It also touches on foreign policy, which, because we were given a word limit, which I took seriously, I didn't really discuss foreign policy in the contribution I offered, but the essay, Gorbachev's own essay, does touch on that. It's in the West, it is what he is most appreciated for, undoubtedly. The sentiment about him in Russia is very different, and we don't have anyone speaking today who really represents that extremely negative sentiment toward Gorbachev. That's something that exists in abundance in Russia, but in Western countries, I think quite understandably, they appreciate his monumental accomplishments rather than his epic failures, because he had both. And unless you understand both of them, you can't really appreciate what Perestroika achieved and what it didn't. In Russia, they focus on the failure, most Russians at least, overwhelming majority of Russians, according to opinion polls, focus on the failures, whereas in the West, the tendency is to look far more to this great accomplishments, the achievements that most people, including me, certainly thought would be impossible. The last thing I just want to mention is there are, however, some what I see as gaps in the essay, particularly with regard to two issues that I had expected Gorbachev to talk more about, which were economic changes. He it certainly discusses this, but I had expected him to touch more in a more extended way on some of the things he wished he had done, particularly in looking at the role of entrepreneurialism, small entrepreneurs, small businesses, to try to open that up in the way it was done in some East European countries. It wasn't done under Gorbachev, and it would prove to be a very costly mistake. And similarly, with regard to agriculture, agriculture had been Gorbachev's in Gorbachev's purview when he was, he had thought when he came into office that he would look in a sustained way at agriculture and try to reform it in a way that would be highly beneficial for the country. That didn't happen. It wasn't by any means just Gorbachev's fault. It had a lot to do with some of the people who were in charge of agriculture, like Murakowski. But still, the lack of much sustained discussion in the essay surprised me some. And I would welcome having Gorbachev contribute another essay that might look at those two issues in a more systematic way. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. Ambassador Matlock, would you like to speak now or to speak the last one?
Well, I can speak now.
Wonderful,
I had understood
please.
in our things that I was scheduled to speak last. However, and I have had trouble understanding completely because of the connections. But I am honored to join this distinguished group. And I wanted to say, first of all, that the message that President Gorbachev sent us, I must agree wholeheartedly with his statement that perestroika is something which is something that affects everyone, that it is that we all need to do some basic changes in our policy. And as I look back at what was achieved during the period of Gorbachev's perestroika, I have just a few conclusions. One of them is the way that the end of the Cold War, which occurred well before the breakup of the Soviet Union, has been interpreted on both sides, East and West, as a victory of the West. I think that is incorrect. I think we negotiated an end to the Cold War, which was as much in the interest of the Soviet Union, maybe more so, as it was to the countries in NATO and the rest of the world. Now, what made this possible? I think that fundamentally, the Cold War was about the confrontation between an attempt based on Marxist ideology of the Soviet Union, at least theoretically, to support the spread of what they call socialism in other countries. And once a country, as the Brezhnev Doctrine indicated, had what they call socialism, then it was up to the Soviet Union to support that regime. Now, this was based upon a number of misconceptions, including one that the type of the regime would ensure that there was a solidarity of purpose. Of course, this was not the case. But I think that by assuming that when the Soviet Union broke up, which broke up not because of the pressures of the Cold War, but precisely because the pressures of the Cold War had ended. And it broke up not because of the pressures of the West, but because of internal pressures, particularly those of nationalism within the Soviet Union. The second misperception is that the Cold War ended with the breakup of the Soviet Union. It had ended earlier. So the combination of misinterpreting these things and in effect proclaiming a Western policy based on what was called the creation of a liberal world order, well, it has turned out to be neither liberal nor orderly. And yet it reminds me of what the ideological basis of the Brezhnev Doctrine, the assumption that if you have what is called a democratic state, although this is never really defined very precisely, that there will be a democratic peace. Now, I know these theories are based upon very slender evidence. Even the definition of what is a democracy, you will hardly find a description. And when we look at today, the use of the terms, and I would have to ask, how is it that Turkey, a NATO member, is more democratic than Russia, which is not. So I think that it is clear that our thinking, as well as the thinking in Russia, needs to change. And I think we Americans should have learned when we think through the costly, what I would call experiment in Afghanistan, to nation build, which, you know, is simply a variant on the idea of spreading socialism and communism when you get down to it philosophically. So yes, let me say, I think we very much need to look carefully at Gorbachev's thinking of what he was able to do with Perestroika, and that the world today definitely needs a rethinking of many of its policies. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Matlock, for these very important comments you just made. I see questions are already arriving in the chat, so I invite everybody to indeed ask question, comments in the chat, and I will be moderating the discussion after. But let's continue for the moment to give the floor to our speaker. We will now have Archie Brown. Archie, can I give you the floor?
Thank you. Thanks very much. First thing to say is that I think that Mikhail Gorbachev's article was a very significant one. It's a tremendously good overview of his reflections now on what Perestroika was trying to achieve and its evolution over time. And it's also self-critical in some respects. I think he's right in saying that 1987-88 would have been the optimal time to launch economic reform, though his critics are very unfair in underestimating the extent of the vested interests within the Soviet economic system opposed to any kind of marketization, and also the political dangers of freeing prices, which would of course mean getting rid of subsidies and price hikes. So precisely the wrong time to do it was in 1990-91, and understandably Gorbachev, though accepting marketization in principle, didn't implement it in practice. However, I mean, his great achievement was playing a decisive role in the pluralization, liberalization, and substantial democratization of the Soviet political system, and in the transformation of the Soviet foreign policy, which played such an important role in bringing the Cold War to an end, as Jack Matlock has just emphasized. There are 3 points I'd like to make extremely briefly. The first is that Gorbachev had a different mindset from any other member of Leonid Brezhnev's or Konstantin Chernenko's Politburo. He had a remarkably open mind for any political leader, never mind a political leader who had risen through the ranks of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. So his views continued to evolve even while he held, not least, while he held the office of General Secretary of the party. The second point is that he couldn't have achieved anything had there not been a constituency for change within the Soviet Union, and there was such a constituency, including in the ruling party. The Western mass media, and I would say governments too, underestimated the extent to which there was a wide diversity of opinion behind the ruling facade which the Communist Party of the Soviet Union presented to its own people and the outside world. Newspapers, TV, understandably, in the pre-Perestroika Soviet period, paid a lot of attention to overt dissidents, but for various reasons, some of them good ones, they didn't pay much attention to the opinion within the party itself, within the party intelligentsia in particular. And the final point is that the Soviet Union was not a personal dictatorship in the post-Stalin years. It was more of an oligarchy. But within that oligarchy, the General Secretary had more power of appointment than anyone else, and he had more possibilities of initiating policy change than anyone else. And therefore, the coming to power of a radical reformer, somebody with a remarkably open mind, could achieve surprisingly substantial things. And so I think that, just to conclude in the final sentence, that Mikhail Gorbachev was fully justified in saying in his article that Perestroika should be evaluated not, or at least not so much, in terms of what it didn't achieve or wasn't given enough time to achieve, but in terms of its tremendous contribution, the magnitude of its contribution to Russian history, and indeed to the world as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Archie. And I would now like to give the floor to George.
Thank you very much, Marlene. It's a great honor to be asked to comment on an article by Mikhail Sergeyevich. He is a man who has for decades been one of my political heroes. I must confess that his leadership was the highlight of my long academic career. Every week it seemed there was something exciting to witness and to interpret. And after almost 2 decades of observing Brezhnevism in power, we finally got a chance to find out the answer, or at least to hope to find out the answer to that question that hung over all of us during the Brezhnev era, and that is whether the Soviet system and its position in the international arena were fundamentally changeable. And Gorbachev's answer, much to our surprise, was yes, they are. Most of us in the West were surprised by that. Most of us in the West assumed that the system would be more durable and that someone would not rise to the top who would challenge many of its fundamental tenets. In the end, Mikhail Sergeyevich did not provide us with conclusive evidence that the Soviet system was reformable. What he did demonstrate was that the mighty Ancien regime was capable of being brought down peacefully, and that skilled leadership could serve as the midwife for the birth of a new, more democratic political order, and for an alternative to the anti-imperialist struggle that constituted the country's defining mission in world affairs in the previous decades. Gorbachev's desacralization of the Soviet political and ideological orders and his midwifery of a new order at home and abroad is, in my eyes, his greatest accomplishment as a leader. His inability to raise the infant into maturity must be his greatest disappointment. Now, the subtitle of my comment on Gorbachev's article is an exceptional leader. And I use that in 2 senses. First, with respect to the scope of his goals. This was exceptional. We did not predict it, and we had good reason not to predict it. It was rather idiosyncratic. And so the scope of his goals was exceptional, but in addition, his personal qualities, his unique personal leadership skills were also exceptional. And so in those 2 respects, I would characterize him as an exceptional leader. I've also characterized him as my hero, but that is because I shared his values, and I quite fully understand that I share his values and therefore count his accomplishments greater than the shortfalls and disappointments of his policies. He is one of my heroes precisely because my values coincide more with his accomplishments. But the Gorbachev phenomenon, the Gorbachev era, raises some retrospective questions that we could ask ourselves, not for empirical verification, but who would have predicted that the nomenclatura would bring forth a leader who was willing to put his career and life on the line to so radically reform the Soviet system and the Soviet Union's mission in the world? And who would have predicted that he would wrestle the political leadership into acquiescing with the direction in which he was trying to go? From the standpoint of leadership evaluation, one can give Gorbachev credit for recognizing that the Ancien regime was a spent force, for his success in desacralizing that old order, and in convincing Reagan and Thatcher that the Cold War was over and that Moscow was willing to accept their definitions of what was in the Soviet national interest. In short, one can one can, from the standpoint of leadership evaluation, give Gorbachev credit for his success in desacralizing the old and birthing the new. One can also give him credit for his exceptional political skill in making his case to the Politburo and Central Committee, and in seizing the political initiative as needed when circumstances allowed. That the ultimate goal of a consolidated new system was not achieved defines the limits of his success, but that bringing down the old system, by which I mean political order, not the Soviet Union, and bringing down the Cold War, that it was done so thoroughly and so peaceably and against such enormous odds is testimony to Gorbachev's place in history. In my eyes, and given my values, it justifies the Gorby mania that engulfed me for more than 6 incredible years. Thank you.
Thank you so much, George, for your comments. Pavel, would you like to add something? Mark, in a sense, invited you to add your own experience to the greetings you read for us from Mikhail Sergeyevich. Would you like to say something before I open the floor for questions?
Well, so far as my experience is concerned, well, I describe it in my books. There's a book just out in Russia, and there will be a second edition of that book. And those who read Russian, I think, will be able to read the book. The impressions, of course, are not so much of the domestic perestroika, but of the end of the Cold War and of Gorbachev's interactions with the American presidents and with other world leaders. But of course, perestroika was part of my life, and as just a human being, I remember the experience of perestroika just like Svetlana does. I was a low-ranking, mid-ranking official at the Soviet Foreign Ministry. My life was very ordinary, and so the changes that happened in the Soviet Union during perestroika, just like Svetlana Savranska has said, were amazing to me as a human being, not so much as a foreign ministry official. I followed the domestic perestroika with certain expectations. And on the other hand, I think I was more realistic than many other people were who expected quick results. The economy was mentioned here, including agriculture. Well, I must say that the problems that Gorbachev faced with the economy and with agriculture were more political. It would have been extremely difficult to, for example, liberate the prices, to release the prices, or even to make certain changes in the price system, as Gorbachev, by the way, proposed to the Politburo in 1987, but he didn't have the support in the Politburo. He didn't have the unanimity in the Politburo on the changes in the price system, which, frankly speaking, would have meant raising the prices for quite a few products, including bread, for example, which was so cheap that people used it to feed their cattle that they had in their private plots. So you shouldn't underestimate the political difficulties that Gorbachev faced. I remember Shevardnadze saying that had prices been raised in 1987, the people would have said that this is all that perestroika came down to. And therefore, it would have been an extremely politically costly step. However, in his article, Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev says that he should have been more insistent with the Politburo. He should have pushed through some kind of a price reform, because that would have been the right moment. He says he should have accepted the political costs. So this is an interesting, I think, point that he makes It is self-critical, but he's also critical of others. He is critical, for example, of the Russian intelligentsia, which took full advantage of glasnost, but at the same time did not give him support when another politician was allowed by Gorbachev to rise, Boris Yeltsin, who with the populist slogans made things much more difficult for Gorbachev. So the intellectuals ran away from Gorbachev in 1990, and practically the entire intelligentsia supported Yeltsin, even though, as I say, no one gained as much from glasnost as the intellectuals, the cultural elite, the artists, the writers, and so on. So I think that the article gives a very objective view of the challenges that he faced. You have to remember that he was only in power a little more than 6 years, and that initially, as he says in the article, it would have been ironic if he had a full program of change in the very beginning, and even in '86. Again, as he mentions in the article, the economists, many of whom later became extremely bold in their support of Yeltsin and in their advocacy of shock therapy in the economy in '85 and '86, during the various economic conferences that were held in the Central Committee, none of them really proposed anything radical or anything that would have been workable within the context of that time. So these are the real problems that Gorbachev faced, and these are this is the context in which he did what he did. And I agree with Jack Matlock and others. He was able to achieve quite a lot. And I think that the changes that we saw later, the groundwork for those changes, I think, was built during the Gorbachev period, when people became different, when they became bolder, when they became more willing to accept change. Then, of course, we've had the 30 post-Gorbachev years. And of course, the assessment of many people in the West and many of my friends here in Russia is that things are going very badly. And that there's been a full backtracking from the Gorbachev accomplishments. I think that's perhaps
Pavela,
a
we
little
have
premature.
to interrupt you very
Yeah,
soon,
I'll just,
so we can keep some time. Thank you.
Right. I'll just say that I think that this diagnosis is premature. I think that while we see a lot of negative things in the state system and the political system, the Russian society continues to change. There are new generations coming on stream, and those new generations were made possible by Gorbachev and Perestroika. Thank you.
Thank you so much for these comments. There are several questions coming. Some are very broad, some are more narrow. We won't have a lot of time to discuss them, but there are two key questions where I would like the panel to reflect on. One is related to foreign policy, what Ambassador Matlock said, that the end of the Cold War is not due to the collapse of the Soviet Union, but on the contrary, to the negotiation that were done between the US and the Soviet leadership under Gorbachev. So I would like you to comment on this kind of foreign policy aspect. And the question on the domestic perestroika, how can we explain the lack of popular support past a certain time? Is that really related to economic issues, or should we take into consideration other aspects that explain the lack of support and the lack of positive image of Gorbachev in today's Russian public opinion, as Mark said? So let's just go around this kind of two questions as a way to give you back the floor, and let's do it in the order you presented. So Svetlana, would you like to begin?
Thank you. Very interesting discussion. Internationally, I would say the Cold War ended much earlier, as Jack Matlock pointed out, than the Soviet Union dissolved. There are great missed opportunities in addition to successes. I think the greatest missed opportunity in foreign policy was the lack of building of the common European home, which was Gorbachev's vision for Europe. As a result, Russia was not integrated in the European security, economic, or political structures. And what we see in Europe now, another Iron Curtain, which moved east, I think is due to a large extent to the inability of European and American leaders at the moment to pick up on Gorbachev's idea. Domestically, I would disagree slightly. I think in 1991, even, the first part of 1991, Gorbachev was still very popular and people had hopes about what Perestroika could still bring. Yes, the economic situation was very difficult, and certainly people do react to the daily difficulties, buying food, buying clothes. They were exposed to the standard of living in the West. They were comparing it to the domestic standard of living, and they had very unrealistic expectations. As far as the opinion about Gorbachev and Russia now, what I would say in my experience and my conversations with people in Russia, his image is actually improving right now. I think more people looking back, they start understanding the role that Yeltsin played and other radical Democrats in bringing about not just the dissolution of the Soviet Union, but the very harsh reform and economic hardship of the early 1990s. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Svetlana. Mark?
Okay, I will only very briefly address the foreign policy issue. I think it's clear that Gorbachev deserves the major share of credit for the end of the Cold War. I would argue, the Cold War ended certainly by the end of 1989, even before all the negotiations on German reunification. It resulted from the end of a tyrannical structure and division of Europe that Gorbachev was willing to certainly to tolerate the overcoming of it and even to facilitate it. So he deserves great credit for that, at least from my perspective. Again, not from the perspective of all Russians, but on other issues, one thing I would take issue with is this was George brought up, and of course this is a widely shared view, is that Gorbachev in his essay says that profound change was needed, and he set out to do that from early on, and that there was a consensus on that in the Soviet Politburo at the time. Clearly, there wasn't a consensus. There was certainly a consensus on the need the economy had to work better and that some reform was needed. That had been, for example, the agenda of Yuri Andropov. But the notion of wholesale political liberalization and democratization was an entirely different matter. There was certainly no consensus on that, nor was there any particular compulsion for Gorbachev to do it. I'm glad he did it, but he was not under any real pressure to do it. There wasn't, the dissidents, I think it was Archie had mentioned, the dissidents were admirable figures, but they had been crushed at the time that Gorbachev was emerging as the favorite to take over. And Gorbachev himself brought back those dissidents, or at least most of them, not Kuryagin, but certainly Sakharov and others, and so again deserves great credit for that. But there wasn't any inherent reason for him to do that. It had to do with his own vision of what the Soviet Union should be. There were, though, leaders like I just want to quickly cite a comment made by the longtime Uzbek Communist Party leader Islam Karimov, who was on the Soviet Politburo in the final year, and he, in a meeting in January 1991, commenting to Gorbachev, so this was early in that momentous year, he said, "Back in 1985, Mikhail Sergeyevich, if I may say so, you didn't have to launch Perestroika. We could have gone on living calmly and reforming slowly, as we did during what they called a period of stagnation. We didn't have to stir up huge masses of people. Everything would have continued as it was, and you would have thrived, and we would have thrived, and no catastrophes of any sort would have occurred," unquote. So that's Karimov's view. I don't think the notion of thriving is accurate, but it does represent a view that was present in the Soviet Union, even at the height of Perestroika, that there wasn't any real need to create such upheaval and change. Again, I'm glad that Gorbachev did it, but I think it's not correct to say that that there was a wide consensus, as Khrushchev says in his essay, or that there was any particular compulsion. The Soviet system wasn't in crisis. It wasn't working particularly well, but that's true of many systems around the world. So the final point then is just to say that Gorbachev's, the choices he made had to do a lot with his values, and also particularly the value that that he was willing to use force in a limited and often not particularly competent way. But when it came to a choice of using large-scale force, of resorting to the kind of mass bloodshed that the Chinese communist regime did in June of 1989, Gorbachev backed away from that whenever that choice confronted him. And it's
Mark,
easy
I
to
will
say,
have to ask you to
I'll
summarize.
finish here, Madeleine. It's easy to say, well, he had to do that, but it's not true. That leaders will often resort to mistaken policies. And so I think Gorbachev deserves particular credit for that.
Thank you, Mark. Ambassador Matlock.
There is a question from Ken Meza about how I felt when I was translating Khrushchev's messages to Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Those of us in the embassy in Moscow at that time did not feel that we were in as much danger as it turned out later we were. We were quite confident that Khrushchev would have to back down. Frankly, we didn't know, for example, that the Soviet commanders in Cuba could actually have launched those missiles. We didn't know about, the possibility that one of the submarines could have used a nuclear torpedo. We assumed that the Soviets had as tight control over these missiles as we did. And we knew that we had total tactical superiority naval in that area. So we were simply waiting for Khrushchev to back down. So we did not feel that we were anyway in danger, because we had only a partial knowledge of the situation. My observation is that is very often the case, that sometimes threats seem to be greatly exaggerated. At other times, even the people involved seem to be ignorant of certain basic things.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Let's now give the floor to Archie.
Yeah, I agree very much with what Jack Matlock has just said and what Mark Kramer said earlier. I mean, there is a kind of economic determinist view of change in the Soviet Union.
I'm not hearing very clearly. If there are any,
I'll speak up, Jack. There is an economic determinist view of change in the Soviet Union that any Soviet leader would have had to do what Gorbachev did because of the economic situation. But this seems to me to be absurd because Gorbachev, as he says in his article, began with an emphasis on economic reform, but quite quickly he gave a higher priority to political reform. And the political reform did nothing to improve the economy. In some ways, it made it more difficult because people could now complain in a way they couldn't complain publicly before. And as for the foreign policy, it's hard to imagine any other member of Chernenko's Politburo making the kind of speech Gorbachev made at the United Nations in 1988, in which he said that people of every country had the right to decide for themselves what kind of political and economic system they wished to live in. And that gave the green light to people in East Central Europe the following year to remove their communist leaders. And that essentially ended the Cold War, because the most important manifestation of the Cold War was the Sovietization of Eastern Europe. And the peaceful decommunization of Eastern Europe was the essential ingredient of the end of the Cold War. Time's short, so I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Archie. George.
I agree that one has to distinguish between the end of the Cold War and the declaration of victory in the West. Back in 1988-89, the Cold War was coming to an end. And we should recall that Ronald Reagan was no longer president as of January 22nd, 1989. So that when we think of the Reagan-Gorbachev relationship, and we think of that as having caused the end of the Cold War, which I think it did, that happened long before the collapse of the Soviet Union. What the collapse of the Soviet Union did, I think, was to create the perception in Washington, D.C. that now we're in charge and that Russia and the former Soviet states can no longer expect us to defer to their interests or concerns. So that then became the basis of the claim of victory and the claim of the U.S. being the international system having become a unipolar system. So I think we should make a distinction between the end of the Cold War and that declaration of victory, because they were quite far apart. On the domestic matters, I think there's to explain why the Soviet Union ultimately collapsed, there's an idiosyncratic factor, and that has been mentioned, of Boris Yeltsin. And it's fascinating to imagine the counterfactual. Suppose Gorbachev had not allowed Yeltsin back into politics after he was purged in early 1987. What difference would that have made to the level of polarization within the society? That's an idiosyncratic factor. But if we think structurally, when Gorbachev introduced democratization and elections basically as the basis of legitimacy for those in the nomenklatura, that interacted with the fact of an ethnically defined federation, so that a local party leader in Ukraine or elsewhere, now being told that he had to build his legitimacy vis-a-vis his population and did not have to be primarily concerned with whether the Central Committee was going to be willing to reappoint him, that meant that they were now looking downward. And looking downward, what you got was nationalism, because the ethno-federal structure of the Soviet Union was defined by that, not by ethnic nationalism in action, but it came to that once you introduced democratization. So that's my take on the unraveling of the Soviet Union, this interaction between the process of democratization and the structure of the Union. But then there was that idiosyncratic factor of Yeltsin who exacerbated it all.
Thank you so much, George. Well, it's already time for us to stop. Unfortunately, there were several other questions about the role of Chernobyl in the launching of or the acceleration of Perestroika, about the August Putsch and the role it has played in also accelerating the collapse, on Gorbachev's legacy today, still in raising awareness to global warming, for example. So a lot of issues that show us this huge legacy of Gorbachev in the way we still think about the world today. I would like to thank all our speakers today. It was really just wonderful to have you very briefly presenting what you have been developing in your respective articles and kind of discussing for our audience. Thank you also to Pavel for being with us today and bringing us these greetings from Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev. Thank you to Demokratizatsiya and its team for publishing this special issue. The journal is available online. All the articles we discuss are there, including the one by Gorbachev, and this seminar is being recorded, so it will be available on the Institute's YouTube channel if you are interested in watching it or in sending it to some of your colleagues. So once again, thank you, everybody. That was the kind of first seminar opening this new semester for IRIS, which is celebrating its 60th anniversary. So that was a wonderful occasion for us to thank you for being with us and to hope to continue to see you very regularly to our events. So once again, thank you. And Pavel, please transmit to Gorbachev, to all of us, our best wishes for his health, of course. And we are all very, very sensitive to his health situation, and hope everything is fine, and the best, all the best from us all. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much.